Thousands of years from now, the universe is dark. Technology peaked at one time and has since fallen into decay. There are those who live and thrive in this darkness, shrouding themselves in it and using it like deadly magic to do as they please. Then there are those who cling to the last of our light, worshipping it, hoarding it, harnessing it to fuel their universe-conquering empire. This is the story of Zahasanko, a being of dark. Hunted by the galaxy for his wish-granting bones, he's on an adventure to kill the man who cursed him and obtain his freedom. This is Dai Dark by Q Hayashida.
Welcome to Manga Mondays, a bi-weekly show where I recommend you greater interest in manga. I'm drinking some Galway black tea, and today we're on our final video in a series on Q Hayashida. First we did all of her one-shots, then we did the short series Maken X, another, and then we did Dorohedoro in the last episode, and now we're doing Dai Dark, the currently running and final series so far. If you're new to this channel, don't forget to subscribe and tell me your best bone joke in the comments in the spirit of today's video. As always, before we begin, I will be explaining the story with light spoilers, so if you haven't read the story already, you may want to do so now. It's real short, 23 chapters. A lot of what makes Q's work enjoyable is discovering the world for yourself, so you may have a better time with it that way. You may like an introduction. With that said, let's begin. First, I want to talk about my experience with Dai Dark. I've been following the series since it started in 2019, which is not something I normally do. I don't really care to check stuff out right away because I don't like reading it 1 week at a time. But at that time, I was probably about 100 chapters into Dorohedoro, and like I mentioned in my last video, struggling to get through it because of how dense the art was. I figured I would take a break from that universe to read Dai Dark, something from this author that was new, who I was really enjoying, hoping that by jumping into a brand new series I'd have an easier time with it. But to me, it didn't really make any sense. Before starting my reread for this video, I remember Dai Dark being all over the place, just generally lacking in direction. That's how I described it to my friends when it came up. I really liked the art and some of the ideas, but it's just not much of a story. Reading it on release, the monthly schedule was very slow and plagued by frequent flashbacks that would mean long stretches without any new plot points, and every chapter felt totally random. This was made worse by the fan translation speed. You see, this was a year before Dorohedoro had its anime in 2019, so it was still pretty underground in the West. There were no translators rushing to get to this story and translate it. Thankfully, it was done eventually, and the English volumes are out now. Reading through it again today, it's actually a very tight manga. From the very beginning, you can tell exactly where it's going, what it wants to do. It name drops the same set of people and groups consistently to give them weight and build them up. Chapter covers and bonus art drawings of our 4 main characters and a couple side characters are there even before you meet them, so you know they're important when they're introduced. Let's go ahead and talk about the world of Dai Dark. That might help with the characters before we get into them. You can pretty much break it down between light and darkness. In this story, our main characters, referred to as the 4 evils, are beings of darkness. You can think of darkness as like an RPG class. They kill and sell bones of rare aliens to buy darkness-type meat, darkness-type armor, darkness-type ships and weapons. Beings of darkness are much sturdier and stronger than beings of light. They work alone and are more or less strengthened by killing others. They're evil in the way they senselessly kill people. They sleep in graveyard dirt or rib cages full of jelly. The main character's enemies are typically beings of light, which you can think of as human-like classes, more fragile and intelligent. These were once a giant cult-like religion who lived for thousands of years using solar power as magic and ruling by their large numbers, but now operate more like a company through individuals that harness solar energy and create machinery and robots. They have modern school planets and retail store planets, which are more like giant ships just floating in space. They're evil in a kind of corporate and religious greed kind of way. Technology for beings of darkness, by contrast, is mostly primitive. Their architecture looks like something you'd see in a supervillain's lair, and Q has a great time walking you through their maze-like ship with built-in swamps, dungeons, and pet flesh-eating spiders' nests. The shopkeep sells our protagonist's new equipment out of a giant floating skull, ripping dark cores from its brain to sell as the AI for ships, which manifests as this funny little guy. For beings of light, like the Solar Mass Empire, the architecture is much more grand, traditional, familiar. Big halls painted with blinding bright white and solar energy powering complex-looking machinery. The old religious sect of the Solar Mass is more like big temples on bright deserts, less complex, more bare and striking. It's difficult for some darkness beings to use their powers here without any shadows, but they're not crippled in the way that beings of light are, just falling apart when they enter darkness. So all that said, this world is cryptic like Dorohedoro, but not in a way that feels unapproachable. It stops to explain things regularly, and while keeping things magical, keeps you on track. I don't think I would have been able to say this much about Dorohedoro in the early chapters, where I was just kind of struggling to figure out what's going on. Now that we've established the world, we can talk about the characters of Dai Dark. The first is Zahasanko. He's only 14, but he's already kind of an urban legend. People say that his bones will grant any wish, so he's been hiding his whole life, even sneaking into a giant floating space elementary school ran by robots, to learn and grow up relatively safe, where we have a lot of our flashbacks during the story. He ties a skin of darkness around his waist, which looks kind of like a cloak with a rope around the middle. It acts almost like a Spider-Man symbiote, covering his body and reflecting bullets until it's torn to bits. You can call on it to have it wrap around his hands and form an axe, his signature weapon, that'll instantly rip the flesh off of bodies when touched. Then we have Sanko, as he's known's trusty package of Akion, a sentient skeleton who can shoot flames and walk around on his own. It seems like he's been with Sanko since the beginning, and as a part of his mythos, people know that Sanko has this package that looks like him. He's also hilarious. His screaming skull face kills me every time. He's a great straight man for Sanko's madness. It's good stuff. You gotta love wacky skeleton characters. I refer to him as a package, and there are all kinds of packages in Dai Dark. Some are jetpacks or suits of armor, some are creatures like Avakion, some are giant spaceships controlling mechs, or life support for old people. They just look a lot like backpacks and seem unique to all the characters. They're packages. Then we have Shimada Death, a beautiful god who's sort of like our Chidoruma from Dorohedoro. She just does whatever she wants and feasts on the souls of the recently dead. Just infinitely magically powered, can fly around in space without a helmet, just does whatever she wants. She hangs out with Sanko like a friend because he kills so often and so diversely that she gets to have takeout food whenever she wants, as she says. Since she has no use for his magic bones, they're just genuine buds. She even turns into a lolly to hang out with him in school, in the elementary arc, and helps him bully his bullies. I think I've mentioned this in past episodes, but I really love super overpowered characters. They're always really funny. I don't know if I'll cover it, but Mashal Magic, that new gag manga, has been one of those that's really funny. And then finally we have Hajime Damamaru. He's a scientist wanted by the Solar Empire for his research, who cannot be killed. He can even revive when he's killed by Shimada Death, the god of death. When he enters the dark world and dies from the pressure, gets blown in half, strung up from wires, has his head crushed, he just sort of gets back up a few minutes later. He also claims to be 16, but looks like an old man, or at least like a fully grown adult. He's not really a being of light or dark, he's mysterious and has valuable bones, just like Sanko, according to the shopkeepers. Those are the four evils, but I'd be remiss to exclude the ship AI Moja, who's very funny and super cute. I would totally get a Moja tattoo on me for sure. One of my favorite characters, probably my favorite character in the story so far, is Shop Valley Box 2, who has one of the sickest character designs I've ever seen. It's also pretty funny and cute. She tries to haggle down Sanko one time, and Shimada Death mentally kicks her ass, and she gets embarrassed by her being bullied, just trying to deceive him. It's pretty good. I guess it's hard to explain, but just go read it, you'll understand. It's a given that Q would have awesome characters that are a ton of fun to watch, knowing her past works. And this is her funniest story yet. Sometimes it just straight up reads like a horror gag manga, especially in the bonus chapters. It's clear that by the end of Dorohedoro, she wanted to get to the lighthearted stuff and just have fun with it again, but she had a long way to go to wrap up some of the serious story beats. This is her exploding with all that fun stuff she'd been holding on to, but on a story path that she'd clearly been thinking about for a long time. It feels very considered and focused, but it's super funny. Without spoiling the few final recent chapters, it also kind of reminds me of Dragon Ball NZ in a good way. It's still like an adventure through space, but there's big bads being summoned by aliens far away that our protagonist need to defeat. He's got cool, crazy hair. And speaking of influences, let's talk about influences from her past works and Q's trajectory thus far. It wouldn't be much of a marathon if we didn't kind of talk about what had come before this and how it influenced this one. The first thing that comes to mind is there's no nipples. I mean, every story has them thus far, and it just feels wrong that Shimada Death gets this close and still no new. First, I actually want to talk about Maken X and Other, that had Q imagining a futuristic techno freeform art style. It didn't really get a chance to show up in Dorohedoro, where magic was really the focus in a more primitive world. I always imagined Q as a fan of cyberpunk, even if ancient magic became more of her deal with Dorohedoro. I always imagined that she wanted to do something more like tech forward in the future. In Dai Dark, the tech really has a chance to run wild and bleed into the magic. Like, how do we know what works because it's tech and what works because it's powered by ancient curses? For example, there's a lot of AI that seems to work organically. There's aliens that may or may not be robots. Characters eat food that starts out as jelly or dust, then it's organized in molds and zapped into creation in 1 second by a combination of these Spy Kids microwaves and the magic of turning this stuff into food. And I've always wanted to talk about Spy Kids microwaves, I just had to bring that up. I'm sure Q is a big fan of Spy Kids, knowing her. And then there's Q's other meaty one-shot that feels like a big inspiration, Underground Underground. This is probably my favorite of her works besides Dorohedoro and Dai Dark. It feels almost like a precursor to this story. It could very easily have taken place in the same universe. It follows Barge, a necromancer outlaw who I could see being one of the four evils. His introduction isn't too dissimilar from Zanka's, starting off mostly dead, reviving, and then showing his bloody OP powers. And oh man, speaking of blood, the gore in this series is turned up to 11, even beyond Dorohedoro or anything else Q's done. It's mostly just skulls and bones, but I'm surprised it all went uncensored as it did, especially in a manga booklet that would share works with like much lighter-hearted stuff. It reminds me of like Pusshead, a legendary heavy metal artist mostly known for his skulls and Metallica art, in that it's like really skull-focused, but it still feels really gory. It's kind of a rough note to end things on, but overall, I just really love Dai Dark. I would 100% recommend this series. Whether or not you're a fan of Q, the story is tighter here than ever. The characters are hilarious and super cool. I'd recommend it as a gag manga, a horror manga, an adventure manga. Just a solid story. The art is brutal, beautiful, horrorcore. It could only have come from Q Hayashida. Thank you for joining me in this marathon. Go read Dai Dark. Have a good day. Have a good night. Peace.